So in this video, we're going to talk about time intelligence functions, and these can be some of the most useful functions that you're going to cover, and because they deal primarily with time series data, which tends to be very common in fields like business intelligence and analytics, these are going to be some of the most common, somewhat complex functions that you can pretty much use in DAX. That's why, like, anytime somebody's asking me, where should I start learning DAX? What are some good use cases? I almost always say time series. There's a ton of time series functions, a lot of time series calculations like period comparison, running totals, rolling averages. A lot of those time series calculations sort of combine time series functions and filter functions, logic functions, aggregation functions. Usually these types of calculations that we're going to be discussing in this lesson kind of overlap with some of the other functions conceptually that we've already talked about, which is why you get so much bang for your buck sort of practicing DAX in the context of time series calculations. So just to kind of quickly run through some of what we're going to be talking about in this lesson, we're going to cover some simple functions like previous month, previous quarter, parallel period, things that help with just like comparing one period of time to another. We're going to talk about ways of calculating running totals, and Power BI it already has some DAX functions like total month to date or MTD and total year to date or YTD built right into Power BI to kind of help make your life a little bit easier when it comes to some of these running totals calculations. And I'm also going to show you how to build some more bespoke running totals calculations that are maybe a little bit more flexible based on the time period that you need to calculate a running period for. And then finally, I'm just going to walk you through some different ideas, different concepts in situations where you maybe need to calculate rolling averages over intervals of time. So there's a whole lot to sort of chew on in this lesson. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing that I'm going to need to do is create some filter logic for my date table. Because as you can see over here, my current date table runs all the way through the end of December 2023. And the fake toy sales data set that I'm working with runs through September 30th, 2023. And because I'm going to be utilizing functions like last date and first date, and I want to make comparisons between these two tables, I could get some kind of wonky results if my date table doesn't align a little bit more closely to the date values in my sales fact table. So there are ways of working around this, but just to keep things as easy as possible, I'm going to go ahead and head over to my date table. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new column, and I'm just going to call this date filter. And the logic for this new column is basically going to be an if statement saying, if the given date that I'm evaluating in this table is less than the last date in my sales table. So in other words, if, any of these date values are less than or equal to September 30th, 2023, and for this I'm going to use a shortcut of the double ampersand, and if the date is greater than or equal to the first date in my sales fact table, then go ahead and give that a 1, else give it a 0. And what this is going to allow me to do is easily filter my date table to match the range of sales dates in my sales fact table. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this date filter so that now when I select the 1 values, I know that I am looking at September 30th, 2023, going all the way back to January 1st, 2022. So I know that that time range in my date table is going to match what's in my sales fact table. It could make my life a little bit easier since I'm focusing specifically on time series calculations in this tutorial. So now that I've got that date filter, I'm going to go ahead and just apply it to this page at all times. And I'm just going to go ahead and hide that and get it out of the way. And now if I pull in my date column and turn off the hierarchy, I should be looking at the date range that I want. And it looks like everything is working just fine. So the first functions that I want to start with are those that are going to help us with period comparison. In other words, maybe comparing the most recent month of sales or revenue to the month before that. So there are a whole bunch of different ways that we can solve a lot of these period comparison challenges. Some are more difficult than others. Some utilize functions that are built right into Power BI, which obviously is intended to make our lives easier. Microsoft wouldn't have developed these sort of shortcut functions for time series comparison if they didn't think that it would make our lives easier and help us write slightly less code. So we're going to start with a group of functions called previous month, previous quarter, previous year. And this is going to help us specifically in the context of, filtering our revenue for 1 month and being able to easily compare, the previous month and sort of compare those two intervals to each other. So first, just so we can kind of follow along with the logic in Power BI, one thing that I really, really recommend that we do here is sort of dump everything that we want to compare into a table so that we can sort of easily spot check ourselves. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this year month field over here, which is literally just every year and month in our data set. You see September 2023, August 2023, July 2023, all the way back to the beginning of our data set. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to grab revenue. And next, I'm going to add another year-month column, and I'm going to turn this into a slicer. And I'm going to sort this in descending order, just like our table here. And now I'm going to grab a card, and I'm going to add our revenue measure that we created in the first lesson of this class, or in the first tutorial of this lesson. And I'm just going to throw this here. You can see that because there's currently no filters applied, I'm looking at 14.44 million, which is the total of my entire sales data set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to first, because I want you to be able to sort of reference the values in this table, I'm going to go to my slicer here. I'm going to head up here to Format, and I'm going to edit interactions. And I'm going to turn off, by clicking on this none icon here, I'm going to turn off the interactions between this year-month slicer and this table, so that when I make selections over here, the table does not filter to show those selections. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to grab September 2023 revenue, which you can see is 658,194. And I'm going to create a quick DAX measure over here that is always going to return the previous month's revenue so that I can easily compare them. And I'm going to call this a really creative name, just previous month revenue. And I'm going to utilize a function that you've already seen before first, and that is calculate. And I'm going to calculate revenue, but this time I'm going to calculate it for the previous month. And now it's asking me for some sort of date column. And what am I going to use? Of course, I'm just going to use the date column from my dates table. And I'm going to go ahead and drop this into the other card. And you can see I'm getting 661K. So 660,877 makes sense for 661K. I just need to make sure that I go over here now that I've created this measure, and I just need to format it. So let's go ahead and make it a currency type formatting. And you can see that now when I have September 2023 selected, this is the value that I'm showing in the first card, but the card that has my previous month logic in it is showing August's. So very, very useful there. And the reason that I'm able to accomplish that, of course, is that if you go to my model, I have a relationship here between my sales fact table and my sales date and the date column in my dates table. That's how I'm able to sort of do these comparisons between my sales data and my date table. And let's go ahead and create another column over here in this table just to see how this sort of cascades down. And you can now see that for any month in my date table, I have revenue built on the relationship between my sales date and my date table. and I have the previous month revenue, you can see that that seems to be working super, super easy, right? And there are also built-in functions to sort of help with when you want to compare quarters and years. And it's kind of the same situation, right? So we're just going to go ahead and create a few more cards here. And let's go ahead and create a new measure called previous quarter revenue. And we're going to calculate revenue, and this time we're going to use the previous quarter function, and we're going to call our date column again, and we're going to add it to this card, and you're going to see a much larger number this time, 2.46 million. And you might be asking yourself, does that 2.46 million represent September, August, and July? Does it represent August, July, and June? What is a quarter in the context of this measure? And so what it's doing here is it's going to look at whatever the quarter is for the month that we have selected, which in this case is going to be the third quarter of the year because we have September 2023 selected. And it's going to look at the previous quarter and return all rolled up revenue for that quarter. So we should be looking at April, May, and June, right? And we can go ahead and test this by selecting April, May, and June. And you can see that when I get rid of September, I've now got 2.46 million here and 2.35 million here. So of course, our measure over here for previous quarter revenue changed, and it now is looking at January, February, and March. So it's looking at Q1 now, which means that when I select January, February, and March from my slicer, the 2.35 million should move over here, and this should then go to December, November, and October of 2022. So let's go ahead and test that. There's my 235 million. There is my 2.16 million. That's how the previous quarter logic is working. And you can see that when I don't have anything selected, all of these measures just get blanked out because obviously this function has no time frame to reference. Because I currently don't have anything selected, it can't make an evaluation on what the previous month or previous quarter would be. Basically, nothing happens here until I start passing some sort of filter value. And I also want to point out that for the previous quarter function, notice that if I click on any month in a single quarter, like July, August, and September all make up Q3, I can click on any of those months and my previous quarter revenue doesn't change until I select a value from another quarter. So this previous quarter revenue is only going to change every third or fourth time that I select a new month. And just to kind of round this out real quickly, let's go ahead and create a previous year scenario just to kind of go through the same thing. And this is going to follow the exact same pattern as the month and quarter scenario. It's not going to populate unless we have something selected. We're going to use calculate. We're going to use our revenue measure. And we're going to pass the previous year function. And we're going to use our date column again, of course. And I'm going to go ahead and drop this down here. And you can see nothing is happening. And when I select 2023-09 or September 2023, what I'm getting here is the entire revenue spanning 2022. So I should be able to test this super, super easily by just going over here and getting rid of year month. And let's go ahead and drop year in. And there we can see 2022 aligns to the 7.48 million that we're showing here. And so that's where that 7.48 million is coming from for the previous year revenue. any month that I select in 2023 is still going to just return 2022's total revenue. And if I go to 2022, this gets blanked out because my data set doesn't have any revenue at all for 2021. So again, these are functions that are not necessarily useful for every single use case, because you can see that they're pretty rigid with how they're programmed to sort of interact with your date table. But in situations where you need, to quickly be able to compare, quarters or months or years against each other, these are some built-in tools that are intended to kind of expedite your ability to perform some of these calculations. Another really useful function to keep in mind when you need to perform this type of period comparison is a function called parallel period. And it's kind of all of the functions that we've just talked about, previous month, previous quarter, previous year, all built into a single function, as, in my opinion, kind of neutralizing or negating, even needing the previous month, previous quarter, previous year functions, because parallel period is kind of a shortcut that includes all of their capabilities in one. So let's go ahead and create a new measure called parallel period revenue. And we're going to use calculate here, no surprise. And we're going to call our revenue function, and this time we're going to use the parallel period function. And you can see here that it's asking for a date column, no problem. I'm going to use my date column from my dates table. And now it wants some number of intervals, and it wants me to specify what type of interval. So first, let's just use 0, and I'm going to use month. And I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of, actually, I'm just going to move these down instead. Don't really want to get rid of anything, just in case we need to reference it later. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up my revenue measure to here, and I'm going to go ahead and select September 2023. There's my 658,000 that we're currently looking at. Now let me go ahead and drop my parallel period measure in here, and you can see that currently it's exactly the same, right? Because the parallel period that I've chosen is 0. So this is a shortcut for just kind of pulling the current month's revenue. But what happens if I change the parallel period from 0 to -1? In this case, you can see that it's now pulling the previous month, right? It's pulling 660,000, and that corresponds with August 2023 when I have September selected. I'm going to kind of move this down a little bit. I keep kind of confusing myself because I'm covering up what I've selected with the formula bar. So hopefully that makes this all a little bit easier to see. Let me go ahead and move this down again. And you can see that now my parallel period revenue, since it's always going to be rolling back 1 month, if I select August, I get July's revenue. And you can see July's revenue over here. If I select July, I get June's revenue, or 808,000. If I decide instead that I want to roll this back 2 months, you can see that September 2023 now gives me July's revenue, August gives me June's revenue, and July gives me May's revenue. And so this can help when you need to do something like previous month, previous quarter, previous year, but you need a little bit more precision over the intervals that you're looking at back in time. So if I need to like skip a few months, if I need to, for example, compare, the last month of of third quarter to the last month of the second quarter, this is sort of a shortcut for doing that. So now, if I want to compare the last month of Q3, September, to the last month of Q2, which would be June, I can just create a version of a revenue measure that rolls the revenue measure back 3 months so that I can now say, okay, in September 2023, we made $658,000 in revenue. And in June of the same year, we made $808,000. So it looks like on a, last month versus last month basis, it looks like Q3 slipped compared to Q2 of the same year. So I like parallel period a lot more than previous month, previous quarter, previous year because I have that kind of flexibility. But there are still perfectly valid use cases for using them. I'm just trying to give you exposure to different time series functions that you can use. Next, I am going to create a new page to kind of help us continue with some of the more complex calculations like running totals and rolling averages.